Welcome to The Exchange. I'm your host, Rob Cox. Today we're talking about Facebook and the regulations governing American IPOs. My guest today is Henry Blodgett. He's the CEO and editor-in-chief of Business Insider. Henry, you're a guy who's been around the bases on this one. You had an interesting post the other day talking about the rules governing disclosure of IPOs and how that might have factored and been a factor in basically making this a, shall we say, not a success of an IPO.
That's right. This was patently unfair, in my opinion, because what happened in the week prior to the IPO was that Facebook actually reduced its earning guidance to the analysts at the underwriters. The underwriters then went out to big institutional clients and said, whoa, second quarter's weaker than we thought, take your numbers down. That was factored into their pricing thinking. Meanwhile, incredibly popular IPO among individuals didn't hear boo about any of this.
Just a little line in the S1 that said, oh, by the way, things are getting tougher in the...
And it didn't even say that. I read it very carefully because that's the defense now, is that it was all disclosed in the S1. You read it and what it said was, as we saw in the first quarter, users are growing faster than revenue. Okay, what does that mean? So are users growing really fast?
Some sort of...
You've got to guess that something's up. And the fact that it appeared certainly looks a little negative, but that's very different than getting instructions to take your estimate for the year down from 5.1 billion to 4.8 billion, which is what the
when you have a bunch
got.
of guys calling you on the phone, it's a sort of warning bell, or at least at the very least it's a pretty clear flag, an indication that this is something that's happening. It's material to the valuation.
It is a waving red flag.
Whereas if you were just sitting there looking in the S1, and I mean like you, we looked at it every time it came out, there were a number of updates. There's no sort of, oh, here's the thing you need to look at. There's
Our second quarter is weak. Right, you didn't see that.
Okay, but here's the thing. Why is this okay? Because this sort of what we would think of as a form of selective disclosure, Morgan Stanley, which was the lead underwriter, is basically saying they followed all the rules. Now you must know about those rules. I know you know about those rules.
I do, unfortunately.
Tell us about it.
Well, what Morgan Stanley's saying, very interestingly, is that these are the rules that were put in place after the research banking scandals of the 1990s, which I was front and center in.
Because you were an analyst at Merrill.
That's right. In the 1990s, analysts were very heavily involved in the IPO process and pitching, marketing, so forth. After the dot-com bust, the regulators came in and said, well, that's ridiculous. Obviously, conflicts, we got to change it. And one of the small things that they changed, as I understand it, is that analysts no longer speak to individual investors. As I recall, in the 1990s, if I remember correctly, I would record a message to any individual investor or any financial advisor who wanted to buy an IPO saying, here's what the company is,
it would go out
here
to the
are our estimates,
force.
it would be available, so forth. So now they've stopped that because the idea was they don't want anybody being tainted by an analyst. You've got to make the decisions off the prospectus. But the problem is, with Facebook, is that there was this big negative news that was conveyed to the analysts. They then conveyed it to institutions, but it was not conveyed to individuals or financial advisors.
How was it conveyed to the institutions?
What Morgan Stanley and all the underwriters did is they got the instructions from Facebook, the analysts took down their numbers, they prepared talking points, they immediately got on the phone because they're allowed to talk verbally to big institutions and say, Fidelity, we've taken our numbers down. Fidelity says, whoa, why? What's going on? Well, they have a discussion about it and so forth. So that's very important information. Meanwhile, the financial advisors and their clients had no idea. So I think that played a role in the price drop.
Now, of course, some people say post the Spitzer scandal, all that kind of, or the thing that you refer to. Now it shows there's a certain independence from the point of view of the analyst. Maybe you would argue it was the case before, but I mean in the sense that they're on the phone saying, look, this is a clear warning. We're taking down our numbers. Presumably, then you're taking a price target down, or I don't even know if they're going that far in the sort of preliminary research. But I mean, what would you say about that?
I think the situation now is actually worse than it was in the 1990s because the analysts are working with the company to get guidance. This was very clear earnings guidance from the company. Facebook called them and said, take your numbers down. And it wasn't vaguely, it was from 5.1 billion to 4.8 billion. You look at all the estimates, they all came down that much. It doesn't happen by chance. So that was the message they got.
No, it was clear guidance from the company transmitted to the analyst community.
So that's not independent at all. It's just that then those analysts are only able to speak to the big institutions and relay the information.
It sounds completely skewed.
It's just grossly unfair, especially in this case, where there was big negative news a week before the IPO.
And it's such a huge consumer
Absolutely.
offering. I mean,
everybody's been positioning themselves for years to try to get in on the IPO and the pop, and then suddenly you find out, wait a minute.
What would be the way to rectify this so that you don't have this allowed selective disclosure?
So there are one of two ways. Either you allow analysts to do their research fully prior to the IPO and publish their reports.
Is that all right? Let's stop there. Okay, say you do that. So you put out a report, it goes to, but still, it would only go to select clients.
Go to anybody who wants it.
Anyone who wants it.
Any client
okay.
who wants it.
Any client.
Individual, institution, they can read it.
Right.
Here are the estimates. Here's the logic behind the estimates. Perfectly fair.
Individual
Everybody
up
has
to
the same
institution. Hedge
thing.
fund guy gets the same thing that Joe
Exactly.
Public does.
And the concern is that an individual would get it and they would read the analyst report as a hype thing, that they would get seduced in by that. Far better that they actually have something that helps them evaluate the company, whether they want to buy it or not, than getting nothing, which is they got the last time, while other people are getting everything.
They'll still have to have like a buy or a sell, or do you get rid of that?
There's a system in the UK that already does this. Analysts publish prior to the IPO. I actually don't know whether there's a rating on it or price target.
I recall, and I could be wrong, but I recall it being very useful, certainly as a journalist looking at these companies and trying to analyze them and imagine as an investor. And it was, obviously they're selling a stock, so there's a caveat emptor, from the start. But it seemed to me that you could get a much better handle on something than just looking at the prospectus.
That's right, and it tells you what to focus on, what's driving the business, and what the bigger picture is. So that's one solution. The other solution is just take the analysts out of it completely.
Right.
Just say you can pick up coverage 25 days after the offering or whatever the quiet period is. Until then, you may not come up with earnings estimates. You may not talk to big institutional accounts about them. You certainly may not prime the sales force with what you're going to be saying.
Right.
You're just out of it. But right now, the way it is before the IPO on the roadshow, they can spend hours and hours and hours on the phone with Fidelity and Capital Research and everybody else talking in detail about the company. And the logic of that is you want people who really understand the business, who can work clients through it. That makes sense. But if you're going to do that, then you got to open it up to everybody.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Henry. Appreciate it. And I think we've solved some of the problems with America's IPO system.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Take it easy. I'm Rob Cox. Join us again for another episode of The Exchange.